Mommy shark do 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 do. Mommy shark do 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 do. Mommy shark do 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 do. Mommy shark. Daddy shark do 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 do. Daddy shark. Daddy shark do 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 do. Daddy shark. Grandma shark do 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 do. Grandma shark do 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 do. Grandma shark do 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 do. Grandma shark. Grandma shark do 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 do. Grandma shark do 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 do. Grandma shark do 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 do. Grandma shark. Let's go hunting. Let's go hunting. Let's go hunting. Let's go hunt. Come on, baby. Save the plastic. Save the plastic. Save the plastic. Save the plastic. It's the end. It's the end. It's the end. It's the end.
Hi guys, it's Miss Meyer with another episode of the Miss Meyer Show. I am a total mess today, so please forgive me because this is just the best I'm going to be able to do. I think I was making sure I even had 2 earrings in because it was that crazy. I spilled my coffee on myself. Crazy stuff. So today we are continuing on with chapter 10, excuse me, but this is chapter 10, part 3. So this is my hair, y'all. Look how bad. Look at this. This is it. This is reality. This is why it's always pulled up. This is what happens when you have curly hair. This is about as good as it's bad. It's bad. That's why it's always pulled up. So anyway, I know, right? We're continuing to talk about chapter 10. This is chapter 10, part 3. So get out your textbooks or whatever, your guided notes, and we're going to go over it. It does look decent. If I I straighten it and I curl it and do all that kind of stuff, it looks okay. But I mean, when I just wake up and don't do anything to it, that's what it's going to look like, and that's not good. Okay. So we're talking about now after the civil rights. Civil rights movement, not really after. I guess this would kind of be like during or in the middle of. Yeah, kind of the civil rights movement is still going on. So that's what the area that we're talking about in chapter 10, part 3. And it's lesson 2. It starts on page 372 in your book, and it's called A New Era of Politics. So the civil rights movement, you had a lot of people joining it because, like we had said before, this movement was not something that was done in secret. Everyone was seeing what was going on. I mean, you could see what was happening. There was stuff on the news every day. There was stuff, in the papers. There was stuff all over that it was just in your face. And because you could not, hide from it, it was always there in your face. A lot of people joined because they could see what was going on. Because before, it was so easy to kind of dismiss it and say, oh, well, I don't really have to worry about that because that's, going on somewhere else. Well, now it's in your face. You're seeing what's going on. You're seeing the students being abused and trying to get into their high schools. You're seeing the sit-ins at Woolworth. You're seeing the, what's terrible things that are happening in the South and things like that. So it's all there. So when people start seeing that, it's right there in their face, they're joining, they're getting involved, and they're saying, okay, I want to be part of the solution, and I want to help. And it wasn't, like I had said before, it was not just African-American citizens of Louisiana or the United States that were part of the civil rights movement. There were people that were from all kinds of different races, in creeds and genders, everything that were coming to fight this. So it was a huge kind of big gathering of people to kind of get rid of ignorance and to stop this. Well, during this time, Jimmy Davis, I remember he's the You Are My Sunshine person, he becomes governor again. Now, this is because, and this is what we see a lot of times in politics, is this called like a pendulum swinging from side to side. So when people get tired of the way someone does something, like let's say that they got tired of the way, which they did, they got tired of the antics of Uncle Earl, even though he was, you never know what he was going to do, and you were like, okay, I want to see what's going to happen now. They got tired of that, and so they elected someone else. They elected Robert McKeithen. They were elected, who else? Elected McKeithen, Keenan. All these other people were being elected that were very different from Earl Long. So what happened with them is people got tired of the way their administration was running things. So Jimmy Davis gets elected again. And Jimmy Davis is once again, like he was in his first term, absent so much because Jimmy Davis was also a performer. He was a singer. He was a famous musician. So he was doing that while he was trying to be governor of Louisiana. And honestly, this time, his second term, he cared more about being famous and being a big singer than he did about ruling Louisiana or I just hate to say ruling, but governing Louisiana because he was always gone. So his second term, Jimmy Davis is most notable for not being there, for just not showing up, just not being there. So that was what his second term was kind of classified by. Now, during this time, the civil rights struggle continue. This is when we see Ruby Bridges. We start to see lots of other schools that are trying to incorporate desegregation. But because of the ruling in Brown versus Board of Education, the all deliberate speed, it was very vague. It didn't give an actual time frame saying, okay, you've got to integrate all of your public schools, or you've got to integrate all of schools by X date. It didn't say that. Because it said all deliberate speed, it basically said whenever you can, which schools could interpret however they wanted. They say, oh, wherever I can, well, whenever I get around to it. But guess what? I'm not going to get around to it, especially in the South, because they were not given clear expectations. It was so just like, it was like, whatever, get it whenever you get around to it. And because the South didn't want it to happen, they just never seemed to get around to it. However, they really pushed for integration, especially in New Orleans. They really, really fought to get it done, to integrate, desegregate all the schools. And Ruby Bridges, she was 6 years old, and she was one of the two, they had 4 African-American students attend 2 previously all-white public schools on November 14th in, what is the date? 1960, okay? And that was Ruby Bridges. She was enrolled at William Frantz Elementary, and Leona Tate, Tessie Prevost, and Gail Etienne, who attended McDonough 19. So you had these 4 girls that were the first really to try and desegregate, or I guess they did desegregate New Orleans public schools. Now, when this was going on, this was a big deal. This wasn't done in secret. In Louisiana, New Orleans, despite, how we are today as New Orleanians and Louisianians, we were not like this always. And the pushback that these girls and their families received was unbelievable. It was dangerous. And we talked about this in class, how horrible it was for Ruby Bridges. As a 6-year-old, I can only imagine what was going on. So on the day after Ruby Bridges went to school, there was more than 5,000 people that went to a big meeting in New Orleans at a city council. And there was a white supremacist leader. His name was Leander Perez. And he started screaming and, fire and brimstone. All these people got them all riled up and saying, don't just stand by and let this happen. You don't let these people, come and integrate schools and you do something about it. And riling up these crowds. So these crowds were getting all crazy. And this guy was like saying, do something. You need some do action or whatever. You can't just let this pass by without standing up. So the people were getting all crazy. And he kind of incited a riot in some ways. Because the day after that, you had huge mobs of, white Louisianians, New Orleanians, that started running through the streets and attacking any African-American they saw. They were all riled up by Leander Perez. And so the next day, they were like, we are going to do something. So they just roamed through the streets of New Orleans and started attacking African Americans. And it was craziness. African Americans retaliated, and they started fighting back. And this is why it made a big deal. The New Orleans schools crisis changed New Orleans. And it really, because of the New Orleans school crisis, we see that the civil rights legislation and civil rights action is actually pushed forward because of the response to the New Orleans school crisis. You see, because what the mob attack, what it did was it really drew our attention to three different things. It really said that it showed that there were very many people in Louisiana that were hostile to any changes in segregation. That there were a lot of people that were willing to get violent because of desegregation, and that needed to be addressed. So that was what it showed us, one thing. Number two, it showed us that the African American community of Louisiana, especially New Orleans, was no longer going to sit passively by as they were assaulted, as they were continued assault, physical, verbal, mental. They were not going to silently just sit there. They were going to push back. So when when the mob was attacking, the African Americans, they started fighting back. They were not going to just stand there and do that. They're not going to continue the nonviolence, that we saw in the last chapter with the sit-ins and things like that. They were like, okay, you're going to hit me, I'm going to hit you back. I'm going to hit you back. So we start to see that there is still a lot of animosity in New Orleans towards desegregation, and it's violent animosity. And we also see how some deranged person can incite a riot with people by just talking to them about crazy rhetoric. We also see that the African American community is no longer going to just stay quiet and let this happen, that they're going to fight for their rights too. I said three, but yeah, so those are three things. Another big thing is that Louisiana and New Orleans itself really saw how damaging the New Orleans school what the crisis and the riots were having on New Orleans. New Orleans at this time was no longer this big, it still was, but we weren't making our money on crops and things like that. We were making our money on tourism. And people did not want to come to Louisiana or to New Orleans if they constantly hear about all the fighting and the damage being done and all this other kind of stuff that's coming. So the business owners of the businesses all throughout New Orleans, especially like Canal Street and the French Quarter, they were hurting financially because people were not coming to their establishments because they were afraid. They were like, okay, so if we go there, somebody, it's going to be craziness. We don't know what we're going to come across. It's too dangerous. So when people stopped going to these places of business, it hit the business owners in the financial pocket. And that is the one place they did not want to be hit. So once they started to lose money, then we see the business leaders and the business owners, the bigwigs, the ones with all the cash, saying, okay, we need to do something right now. We need to really push forward. We need to push these civil rights forward so this can stop. It wasn't because they were, not all of them. I can't speak for everybody. But it wasn't because they were, I have so much moral obligation. This is so morally wrong. I've got to stand up and speak my mind. It was not about that. It was about money. Business owners, the business leaders, they were seeing their pocketbooks get substantially hit, their wallets getting smaller, and then they were like, okay, something needs to happen. We need to fix this. So it was money that prompted the action in really pushing forward with the school crisis. But it still pushed forward, but it was not like because they were, feeling morally obligated or whatever. It was just because we weren't making any money. Same thing with the Montgomery bus boycott. They stopped, why they stopped doing all their, separation with the seating and all that kind of stuff? Because they weren't making any more money. Woolworth's counter too, they started integrating their lunch counter, saying that African Americans and white citizens could sit at their lunch counter, that it was open to everyone of either race or any race. The reason they did that wasn't because they suddenly just came to a revelation of what they were doing was wrong. It was because they were getting hit financially, because people were not going. They were saying, you know what? I'm not going to go. Because if you wanted to damage a business, if you truly wanted to do anything to make people listen, especially when they're a huge corporation, you hit them where it hurts, and that's the pocketbook. So when people started saying, you know what, I'm not even going to Woolworths, and it wasn't just people that were against segregation. It wasn't just freedom fighters. That's what their name was. It wasn't just them. It was regular patrons too. They could have been they either side of the whole fight of segregation and desegregation, but they weren't attending these places because they're like, I don't want to be involved in all this craziness. I just want to go and eat lunch. So I'm going to go somewhere else. So Woolworth saw, oh my goodness, we are losing serious money here because people aren't coming anymore because of what's going on. Montgomery bus boycott. Well, we're losing patrons. We are losing people. We're not making any money. So that is what kind of spurs everything forward with the civil rights movement as far as companies and large corporations go, because they were really getting hurt financially, and that was the biggest way to hit them. We have at this time, we still are at this point in American history, there is still a lot of animosity between, groups of people, especially in the South. You still had groups like the KKK that were pushing, crazy agenda. There were still groups that were like the White Knights of the White Camellia, the Dixiecrats, that were really just total, complete racist groups. They were still in effect here, but we were inching forward towards the entire, the civil rights movement. Now, in 1963, after John F. Kennedy was assassinated and killed, Lyndon Johnson, his vice president, became president. And when Lyndon Johnson became president, one of the big things that he said that he was going to do is he was going to carry on the legacy of JFK in his civil rights agenda. So, because JFK was an advocate for civil rights and for equality in those kinds of things. So when he died, Johnson said, well, I'm going to follow through with what he started. And he signed into law the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. These were two acts that turned into law that prohibited discrimination in any place of public use. And he said that if you receive public funding, you were not allowed to discriminate, and it needed to be done right now. If you want to get your money, you're going to end segregation right now. So the schools, they're like, okay, we get public funding. Well, guess what? You want this public funding, you better stop whatever you're doing. You better get this under control. They're doing it. If you are a bus, if you are a bus company, if you are, a military organization, if you are a polling place when people go to vote, if you wanted to get your money, you wanted your federal dollars, then you had to stop segregation right away. Also, the Civil Rights Act, it outlawed anything like separation by races, of anything that said, like white here, colored here, that stops. It is against the law. You cannot do that. Like hospitals, schools, train stations, everything was like bathrooms, everything stopped. No more. It ended it, 1964. And it also created the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. And what this was to make sure that employers were hiring people based on merit and saying, okay, no, you're not going to get this job because you're an African American. Oh, even though you know more, you're still not going to get this job because you're not an African American. Because you're an African American. So the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission just saw that the companies were fairly assessing people that were applying for jobs, that would not just look at the color of the person's skin and say automatically, well, no, you're not a good fit here. So that made them, it enforced it, it oversaw it. So it's one thing to put something in law, but it's another thing to make sure that it's happening. So the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission oversaw that this was continuing to happen, that companies were fairly considering fairly considering people who wanted to work at their workplace based on their ability and not by the color of their skin, which is a big deal. Now, the Voting Rights Act, the very next year in 1965, now this outlawed remaining barriers to vote because there still were barriers to vote. Some places still had a literacy test. Some places still had silly clauses and things that disenfranchised African American voters and poor white voters. So this Voting Rights Act of 1965 did away with all of that. Said it's completely illegal. You cannot do this anymore. It outlawed literacy tests and other means of keeping voters from registering. and it allowed the federal government to send examiners to make sure that the voting places were complying with what needed to be done. And that's the same thing they did with the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. It's one thing to say this is a law, this must be followed, but going from going from experience, especially in the South, they don't like to follow these rules, and you need to give them explicit directions and explicit times. So the Voting Rights Act sent individuals to oversee whenever there was a vote, or whenever there was an election, to make sure that the polling places all throughout the southern states, the country really, to make sure that everyone had an equal and free right to vote, that there was nothing preventing them from voting at the polling place. They're still there. So like this last big, I think, election that happened, I don't know, this year, I don't even know when it was. It was recent. I remember. But they had, they had members of the committee to make sure that there was no one trying to influence your vote. There was no one trying to scare you into not voting. I mean, they still exist, and a good thing too, because before then, especially once Reconstruction was over, you had so many people that were really kind of intimidating you to tell you to vote one way. Even Huey Long, I mean, his people, when he was running governor and in politics, he had people saying, you're going to vote for Huey's way or no way. I mean, so this really established fair voting in Louisiana, and just not only Louisiana, but the entire world. It was a big deal. They called these two acts, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, they called them the Second Reconstruction. And they did this because really this is when the government stepped in, Johnson stepped in and said, okay, I'm not playing with you guys anymore. I'm telling you this needs to be done right away. And not only am I going to tell you it needs to be done, but I'm going to go check and make sure it's done. So like if your parents tell you, you better go clean your room or you're in trouble, and I'm going to come up there and check. Well, you're going to make sure that you do a good job cleaning your room because you know that your work is going to be checked. It's going to be someone is going to be behind you saying, okay, well, let's see if they did a good job. So because there was an oversight, because there was a governmental oversight saying, hey, this is what we're going to be doing, we're going to make sure this happened, they called it the Second Reconstruction. Because remember, in the first Reconstruction, military commanders and the southern states became military districts where they were under the control over the United States military, who made sure that they implemented the programs that we had during Reconstruction. So that's why they said that. But even with all of the oversight, even with, everybody looking and, making sure that things are happening, it wasn't until the early 1970s before many of the school parishes in Louisiana desegregated. I mean, even still, your big parishes, yeah, they happened pretty quickly. But other parishes, it took almost, another 7-8 years before other parishes started desegregation. Because if the smaller parish that you lived in, the less oversight, really. The big parishes, yeah, they had more oversight because they had more people. But the smaller the parish, you didn't have as much. So that's that. Now, McKeithen, he becomes governor. Now, McKeithen is openly opposed to desegregation. He did not like desegregation. He was not happy about it. However, he did push forward a lot of, changes for Louisiana. One of the biggest things that he did was getting and starting the construction of I-10. Now, I-10, if you don't know New Orleans, don't know your way around New Orleans, or anywhere, driving, whatever, I-10 is a major intersection. It's the interstate, major interstate. And you can travel I-10 through New Orleans, through Baton Rouge, all over. And it snakes through the city. I-10 purposely does this. So when I-10 was created, now you remember Louisiana at this time, and even still, we got a lot of our money from tourism. So when McKeithen and when they put into place, they constructed the I-10, they made sure to make it go through the city of New Orleans, so that when you were on it and you looked from side to side, you would see the French Quarter over there. You would see the St. Louis Cathedral in the background. You would see downtown New Orleans. You would see these things because it figured if people saw them, like, oh, I want to go there. I want to go there. And even today, you go down I-10, I'm going to go past the Superdome. You're going to go past the entrance to the Quarter. You're going to see all the Smoothie King Center, all that, I-10, okay? So that was a really big deal as far as Louisiana was concerned, especially tourism. We built the Superdome. The Superdome was built right there because of that. All that was to increase our tourism and to increase people coming here to spend money. And it works. You know, I think you pass it. I don't know, I haven't been on I-10, I couldn't even tell you. But I think you pass like Tipitina's and all kinds of, that's just how long I have not been on it. So, but I know that I used to ride all the time to Metairie. So I would go to I-10 and I would get off on some exit. I can't remember that one, but I know that I was always on it. Anyway, so at this time too, you start to see a lot of people getting frustrated with the nonviolent protest. Dr. King, unfortunately, sadly, was assassinated right around this time, right around after, not too long after JFK. And we start to see a movement where, you know, it's not necessarily nonviolent protest. I mean, a lot of the protests with Dr. King were very advocated nonviolence, you know, to just not attack, just sit there calmly. Well, we have more groups that come around and they are, you know, frustrated with the slow pace of progress that the nonviolent sit-ins and stuff seem to be taking. So they came up with their own group, and they were really focused, instead of, you know, pushing forth political agenda and changing laws and overturning, you know, jurisdiction mandates or whatever, they were focused on helping the community, the human's rights. And we had the Black Power movement. Now, the Black Power movement was based on humanity. It was based on providing basic needs to African American communities. It was on basic human rights like food and shelter, the ability to find a job, you know, taking care of your family, and to being proud of being, you know, an African American. Because for so long, I mean, come on, you've had people telling you, if you were an African American, that you were second-class citizens, that you weren't equal to anyone else, and this. So yeah, so the Black Power movement and the activists were really about encouraging your pride. Be proud of of your heritage. And they were there to help people that before, you know, maybe did not have the ability to access things that they needed to. They fed kids, they did after school programs, they taught people how to read. They did all kinds of things. I mean, just to, not just in Louisiana, across the United States, to really help the Black community as a whole, and not just in the legal sense, which was very much what was happening with the nonviolent protesters, especially with like the NAACP, Thurgood Marshall, and even Dr. King. So we also had at this time another group that was called the Deacons for Defense. So the Deacons for Defense, they were associated with the Black Power movement, but their goal was different. Whereas the Black Power movement was focused on the humanity side of civil rights, you know, making sure you had, like I said, jobs, housing, clothing, food, finding healthcare, finding work, things like that. The Deacons for Defense, their goal was to protect their civil rights workers from violence. They were kind of like bodyguards, because it was a very dangerous job. And so they were there to make sure that nothing happened. And so, because people were willing to be a civil rights activist, but you were taking your life into your own hands. The Deacons for Defense, they really protected the civil rights activists, not just African American ones, but any color, any race or whatever. They were there to protect you, to make sure that nothing would happen. So that's about it. All I've got for you for this part. In class, we're going to talk about the shift in politics in the South from the Democratic shift. It was primarily a Democratic shift over to a Republican shift. And we're going to talk about I think probably we'll talk about that, and then I guess we'll talk about just the new government, the changes that are happening in the government. Okay? So that's all I've got for you guys today. Make sure that you put in your code word for your exit ticket. I apologize for my terrifying look of just bleh. But I'll see you guys in class. Have a fabulous weekend, and that's it. Adios.
On a hot day in August 1963, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. delivered a speech that would define the civil rights movement and his legacy. This, of course, was his I Have a Dream speech, delivered on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial during the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom.
I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today.
The March on Washington served as a massive push for economic and political justice for African Americans. Held during the year celebrating the 100th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation, crowds marched on the National Mall to watch a variety of musical performances and speeches. Dr. King, a Baptist preacher and prominent civil rights leader, was scheduled to speak towards the end of the day, his debut on the national stage. Up until that point, King mostly addressed small crowds at black churches, rallies, or fundraisers. This time, he would be seen by nearly 250,000 people on the ground, as well as millions at home watching on television. This was an opportunity to reach a wide audience and persuade the public and the government to take action against racial injustice. The night before, King worked with a close group of advisors to get the speech just right. They worked through the night, settling on a final draft in the pre-dawn hours of August 28. Interestingly, the phrase, "I have a dream," a phrase he used in earlier speeches, was nowhere to be found in this copy. The words wouldn't manifest until almost halfway into Dr. King's speech, when gospel singer Mahalia Jackson, who had performed earlier in the day, called out to him from the sidelines to tell them about the dream. King set his prepared remarks aside and improvised the rest, crafting a soaring speech that would sear into the minds of millions of Americans.
No, we are not satisfied, and we will not be satisfied until justice rolls down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream.
The speech was divided into 2 parts. The first listed the injustices that African Americans faced: segregation, police brutality, disenfranchisement, and discrimination, and urged a call to nonviolent action. The second launched into King's dream of peace and racial harmony, a vision of a future in which people will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character.
I have a dream.
Highlighting King's skills as a preacher, I Have a Dream was part sermon and part poetry, using rhetorical devices like repetition, rhyme, and vivid metaphor to drive his points home. It was peppered with historic, biblical, and literary references that moved the crowd. This message of struggle and hope became the defining moment not only of King's career, but also the civil rights movement. Both the speech and the March on Washington were credited with helping secure the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, a landmark piece of legislation that ended segregation and banned discrimination on the basis of race or sex in the workplace.
Free at last! Free at last! Thank God Almighty, we are free at last!
The speech also resonated with activists around the globe. I have a dream. The phrase that wasn't even meant to be in his final draft appeared in political actions all around the world. It's considered one of the world's most transformative and influential speeches, alongside others like Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address and Winston Churchill's Blood, Toil, Tears, and Sweat. I Have a Dream is only one of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s many achievements, but it's nonetheless one of the most pivotal.
I am happy to join with you today in what will go down in history as the greatest demonstration for freedom in the history of our nation.
When we turned the corner, I saw all of these people.
November 14th, 1960. It was 6-year-old Ruby Bridges' first day of school at William Frantz Elementary in New Orleans.
I remember them chanting 2, 4, 6, 8, we don't want to integrate.
It had been 5 years since the U.S. Supreme Court mandated the desegregation of schools. Now Washington was putting pressure on Louisiana and other states that had yet to comply. In a veiled attempt to appear compliant, city officials in New Orleans gave 150 black kindergartners an entrance exam, one they had no chance of passing. But 6 of the 150 passed that test. Ruby was one of them.
Everybody was coming over and congratulating my parents. She's so smart, she passed, we're so proud of her. So I actually thought that I was so smart that I passed this test that would allow me to go from first grade to college.
3 girls, including Ruby, were selected to attend William Frantz Elementary. But by the first day, the other 2 girls had dropped out, making Ruby the only black student in the school.
My parents only said, Ruby, you're going to go to a new school today, and you better behave. There was a knock at the door. My parents opened the door, and 4 very tall white men were standing at the door. And I remember looking at them and thinking, well, who are they?
Those 4 men were United States Marshals sent under order of President Eisenhower. Their job was to escort Ruby to and from school. One of the men was Charles Burks.
Well, we had a lot of demonstrations against what we were doing. The main thing was just be sure nothing happened to her. So we'd tell her, just stay close to us. We'll be all right.
There were barricades everywhere. There were cameras everywhere. I thought I'd stumbled into a parade. I actually thought it was Mardi Gras.
It didn't seem to bother her any. She was just doing what she had been told to do.
Ruby's mother went as well. Once inside, they were taken to the principal's office where they stayed all day. There, they watched white parents scramble in and out of classrooms, taking their children out of school.
500 kids walked out of school that day. And I didn't know what was going on because nobody explained anything to me. Finally, the bell rang and someone came into the office and they said, school is dismissed. You can leave. And I remember sitting there and thinking, wow, college is easy.
By the next day, the crowds had doubled.
And they kept pointing at me and shouting. They kept saying, we're going to poison her. We're going to hang her.
I was in favor of what we were doing. I knew what we were doing was right, and we were going to make sure it happened.
This time, Ruby was taken to a classroom.
I remember looking into that classroom, and all I saw was empty desk. I didn't see one child.
But there was one person there, her teacher, Barbara Henry. Coming from Boston, she was the only one willing to teach Ruby.
I remember looking at her and thinking, she's white. I'd never seen a white teacher before. She looked exactly like the people outside. She wasn't. I always say that she showed me her heart.
The following week, students started to return. But the principal confined Ruby to her classroom and didn't allow her to play outside or eat in the cafeteria.
I remember going to the back of the classroom to sharpen my pencil and you could look onto the playground. There was these huge oak trees, swings and slides and basketball goals. And I kept thinking as I sharpened my pencil, where are the kids?
By the end of the school year, the protests had disbanded, and Ruby was finally allowed to meet the other children.
I finally found them, you know, I was so excited. So I went in to play with them. This little boy looked at me and he said, "I can't play with you. My mom said not to play with you because you're a nigger." So that's what this is about. It's not Mardi Gras. And this isn't college. It's about me. It's about me and the way I look and the color of my skin. And in my mind, that was okay. Yes, he hurt my feelings, but I wasn't angry with him because I felt like he was explaining to me why he couldn't play with me. If my parents said, "Ruby, don't play with him. He's Asian, Hispanic, Indian, Muslim, white, mixed race, Jewish, gay," I would not have played with him. I didn't feel like there was anything for me to forgive. The fact that in my mind, he was explaining to me and that I would have done the same thing. It wasn't like I was angry with him, so there was nothing there to forgive. The fact that when I passed the crowd, I thought it was Mardi Gras, there was nothing there for me to forgive.
Ruby returned the following year. She had a new teacher and a room full of classmates. She went on to attend an integrated high school and eventually graduated from Kansas City Business School with a degree in travel and tourism. And when she married and began raising a family, she taught her children to rely on God.
She always falls on her faith, and she makes sure that you do so as well. So it doesn't matter what you go through, doesn't matter who hates you, who dislikes you. As long as you have that faith and that relationship with God, you're fine.
Ruby returned to William Frantz Elementary in 1993 when she enrolled her 4 nieces. She witnessed the same racism she had seen as a little girl. So to build bridges between the races, she volunteered as a parent liaison and established an after-school multicultural art club. Soon after, she launched the Ruby Bridges Foundation and began sharing her story with students all over the U.S.
I see hope that most of us don't see. I'm in schools every day. I am so humbled by the way my story moves kids. It's so simple. How Mrs. Henry didn't judge me. How all I wanted was a friend. Kids get that, they understand that. Our kids know nothing about racism. It's us as adults. We take racism and we pass it on to our kids. And that's why it's still around. Each and every one of us come into the world with a clean heart. I believe that if we are going to get past our racial differences, even today, it's going to come from our kids.
It's been over 55 years since Ruby walked up those steps and took her place in history. Today, her legacy continues to make a difference.
I was happy to see what she did because I knew it could be done. I've always told Ruby that, and I'm glad I was there, able to have something to do with it.
To have equality, it takes someone with courage to make that change so that we can come together. And you have to have a great, faithful foundation to stand up for something that you truly believe. My superhero, she does that every day.
Out of the commandments, if you could only keep one, the one you should keep is love thy neighbor. That is the key. And I have to care about you as a person and a human being. I really believe the longer I live that it really has everything to do with love.